Gretchen, over to you and the judge.
So do police have the right to arrest the mentally ill on the streets for skipping their medication on or off the streets? It's a question that's come up several times in the wake of multiple mass shootings now and some subway attacks here in New York. Well, now New York City police are taking the idea one step past that. The nation's largest police force putting together a so-called most wanted list of mentally ill patients, and officers plan to arrest them even though they haven't committed any crimes. So what would our Constitution say about that? Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano joins me
You always
now.
give me the easy questions.
No. I just think we might have a lively discussion about this because it's an issue that's complicated.
Yes.
So if you come to New York City or any other major city, you see mentally ill people walking on the streets, many of them homeless, and it's a dire situation. You say that rounding them up and arresting them is unconstitutional.
Well, it's clearly unconstitutional because the Constitution says the only way you can arrest someone is if you see them committing a crime or have probable cause to believe they have committed, not are going to commit, but have committed a crime. Now, in the case of someone who is mentally ill, mental illness is a range, is a terminology used to apply to a range of mental deficiencies. Could be very mild or very severe. Only those who are mentally ill and are in imminent danger of harm to themselves and others can be in the category of candidates for arrest. Anything short of that, the person cannot be arrested without an order from a judge.
So what happened is, in the last couple of months here, there's been these two subway attacks where allegedly mentally ill people pushed innocent people out onto the tracks and they died. My question to you, though, is how do you know at what level that mentally ill person is? How can a police officer gauge that when he or she's walking down the street and know whether or not they're to that point that you're describing?
They can't, and it's not their job to do so. That's why if a person is been adjudicated a danger to themselves and others and is not incarcerated, that's one thing. But a cop looking at somebody in a subway saying, I think you're crazy, I think you're going to push somebody into the subway, the path of the subway train, and therefore I'm going to arrest you, that's not permissible under our system. We do not have a system of government that lets the government predict who's going to do the wrong thing and arrest them before they do it. The police should be there to keep us safe. The MTA should operate subways and subway platforms that are safe, but you can't arrest groups of people because of what some one or two among their number are likely to do. That's what they did in Eastern Europe when we overthrew those governments.
I think that people, though, who have been victims of crime or threats resulting from situations like this are frustrated. Because many times you cannot mandate for mentally ill people to take medications. And when they're on medications, they're fine, but when they're not, they can be violent.
So that's the gray area where a person has been ordered by a judge to take their medication and doesn't, and then may be in a position where they could harm someone. That's why we have a Second Amendment, so we can protect ourselves.
And that's why he knows the Constitution. Judge, great to see you. Hope you had a great weekend.
Pleasure. Thank you, Gretchen.
Well, new developments as the debate intensifies over how to protect gun ownership rights while reducing gun violence. Several states now anticipating the passage, perhaps, of some sort of ban at the federal level, are passing or pursuing their own legislation. In particular, legislation that would say firearms made and then kept entirely within a state's borders, they don't cross interstate lines, would not be subject to any federal regulations. But is that legal? Joining us now, Judge Andrew Napolitano, our Fox News senior judicial analyst. So as I read it, I think about 9 states since the new push for gun control has started have submitted bills that are working their way through these legislatures, but 15 in total have either already passed or are looking at some sort of measure to say, feds, you can do whatever you want. President Obama, you can do whatever you want, but you're not going to mess with Arizona, Colorado, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, North Dakota, Nebraska, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Virginia, or Wyoming.
You know, if this were 200 years ago and the Constitution were new and it meant what it said, this legislation would make sense, because at the time Congress only regulated commercial goods that actually passed from one state to the next. This is the so-called Commerce Clause, Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. But that clause has been so blown out of proportion, Megan, by presidents and Congresses and Supreme Courts, that Congress can now legislate almost anything it wants, even something that doesn't move from one state to another, even something that isn't commercial in nature, simply because in some theoretical way, its movement or non-movement might have some effect on interstate commerce.
Yeah, and we saw this in the lead up to the healthcare debate,
yes,
where the president said the Commerce Clause allowed it, but which, by the way, the Supreme Court rejected. But he based that argument on Wickard v. Filburn, which is an ages-old case. You learn about it in law school, where some guy growing wheat in his own backyard and not distributing it to anybody was said to affect interstate commerce. And so that wheat never left his backyard. These guns will never leave these states. But you tell me, Judge, why would these states be trying to tee up, because that's what some of them say, they're trying to tee up a challenge that would go to the Supreme Court in light of some pretty clear precedent that the federal law will prevail over these individual state laws here?
That's a great question. I think there's probably a couple of different lines of thought behind it. One is that if enough states agree, Congress might back down. Remember, the states can amend the Constitution independent of the Congress if enough of them want to. Another is, it's a different Supreme Court. It's a Supreme Court that twice within the past 5 years has upheld the individual right to keep and bear arms and basically said to states and cities, don't try interfering with that right. So they may very well carve out an exception to Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce when it comes to a fundamental right, like the right to keep and bear arms. But on its face, as much as I love this legislation, and as much as I wish it would be constitutional, it is directly opposed to 60 years of Commerce Clause jurisprudence, which basically lets Congress regulate anything it wants.
But do you see anything in the recent health care ruling? Because President Obama won that case based on his power to tax us,
right,
not on his powers under the Commerce Clause, or Congress's powers under the Commerce Clause, I should say. Is there anything in that decision that suggests a more narrow interpretation of the federal government's abilities to regulate us if we stay within state borders, and perhaps some hope for these states that they'll get a different result? Or maybe they think this court won't see things the way the Wickard v. Filburn court saw things.
Right. Well, Wickard v. Filburn, as you say, is the farmer growing wheat in his backyard. But listen to the rationale that the court used. Because some of that wheat was watered by water that originated in Indiana.
And that's where they're going to go with the guns.
Ohio.
That's where they're going to go with the guns.
Exactly. Because some of the cows that ate the wheat ended up in people's bellies in New Jersey. Therefore, it affected interstate commerce. This is ridiculous lines of argument. It's a rationalizing away the Supreme Court, the Constitution's intent, but this is the way lawyers and members of Congress and judges work. I think it's going to come down to Justice Anthony Kennedy again.
What I hear you saying, though, the bottom line is these individual states that are passing these laws that are trying to preempt the effect of any federal assault weapons ban, they are not likely to be upheld. And if these states don't like that law, then they need to lobby right now before it becomes a law, because once it's a law, they're going to be subject to it.
Correct. I think they can send a message to the Congress and the courts, and maybe that message will be popular.
Got it. Judge Andrew Napolitano, always great speaking with you.
Pleasure, Megan.
Thank you, sir.
Guilty as charged, Jesse Jackson Jr. telling a judge he is indeed guilty of conspiracy in connection with a lavish spending spree on donors' dimes. Federal prosecutors say that Jackson spent $43,000 on a Rolex, $9,500 on kids' furniture, and more than $5,000 on furs. That's just to name a few goodies. The former Democratic lawmaker faces nearly 5 years in the slammer, but he's not facing, at least not yet, much slamming in the media. Why is that? Judge Andrew Napolitano is sounding this hypocrisy alert.
Well, I wish I knew the answer to this, but we've actually seen articles this afternoon in the blogs, the papers will come out tomorrow, that don't have D. Illinois after his name, as you always see after the name of a sitting or recently resigned public official. So Jesse Jackson Jr., not a Democratic congressman from the city of Chicago. Unlike when Tom DeLay was convicted, you always saw a Republican former majority from Texas, and Duke Cunningham and Jack Abramoff and that crowd. Not to minimize the crimes of one or maximize the crimes of the other.
But treat both the same.
Right. It is interesting how our colleagues in the media, especially those on the left flank, seem to rejoice over the downfall of people they disagree with politically and try to not cover with great detail the downfall of those whose politics they agree with.
I'm wondering, too, that, you know, the way this is presented time and again when we have an issue that comes up with, it's a left or right issue. The left is cut a great deal of slack, not so much the right. And I'm just saying, whether it's a left or right issue, cover both the same.
Absolutely.
If you're going to go after, the improprieties of one candidate, go after the improprieties of another with the same abandon, if you must, but with the same zeal.
Agreed. His father is a historic figure, like him or love him, like him or dislike him. The father has friends across the political spectrum. But what he did, what he pleaded guilty to, the deal that he got is of paramount public interest. The public has the right to know about it. They have the right to know who he is, no matter who his father is. And they have the right to know the depth and depravity of his criminal behavior. I might add, his lawyer cut a very good deal for him. He could have faced 26 years in jail.
What do you think
He's
will
now facing
ultimately
5.
happen? And do you think he'll ever serve a day?
Oh, yes. I think
You
he'll
do?
be sentenced to the full 5, and under the federal system, he'll serve 80% of that, which is 4. There's no time off for good behavior. There's a minuscule time off for good behavior. There's no early release in the federal system. The rule of thumb is 80% of the time to which you're sentenced. And then we'll never hear from him again, sort of like Blago when he went away. All that bluster that preceded his departure, followed by silence.
Invisible.
But where were the microphones going up to him and his father as they exited the courthouse in Chicago this afternoon? I didn't see him.
Yeah, I didn't see him either. And your homework assignment tonight, folks, is to look at your papers tomorrow. And I'd love to be proven wrong, but have at it. That's tonight's assignment. Better get it done.
I guess if we are proven wrong, I got to be back here with a mea culpa
Yes, you do.
tomorrow.
Yes, you do.
Isaac exposed a heck of a lot of BP's oil. We saw about 20 miles of Louisiana's coastline closed down because of the oil that was there. We found it in a bay that we hadn't seen it at such levels before.
And many of the folks that we've talked to down here say that simply by not settling and choosing to go to trial, Shepard, they believe is indication of British Petroleum's arrogance with this whole thing.
Arrogance from British Petroleum. All right. Casey Stiegel at the courthouse in New Orleans this afternoon. Casey, thanks. Let's take this to the judge now. Our senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, is with us in Studio B. I want to set straight, and this was mentioned in his report, but here's the key to all of this. BP was either negligent or it was grossly negligent. If it was negligent, it's going to pay $1,100 per barrel spilled as a civil penalty. If it was grossly negligent, it'll pay $4,300 per barrel. So if it's negligent, the penalty is $4.5 billion. If it's grossly negligent, the penalty is $17.5 billion. And that's a big difference, Judge.
Well, of course, it's an enormous difference. You're talking about tens of billions of dollars of difference. Those figures are established by a statute enacted by the Congress. This is not just some rule made up by the court, nor is it some rule of thumb that judges use in cases like this. The Congress wrote a law back in the Clinton administration. President Clinton signed it into law, and that's the standard that's used when you have these spills. So how do they decide whether they were negligent or gross negligence? What's the difference between the two? I'll give you an easy example. You drive your car 40 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, that's negligence. You drive your car 80 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, that's gross negligence. It has to do with how much you avoided the duty you have to preserve the asset and to keep the people that work for you and the property around you safe.
Okay, a more closely tied example might be, if you were trying to save money, but you didn't realize where you were skimping was a real problem and might cost lives, that's one thing. But if you saw there are problems here, we know the rules, we're breaking the rules to save money.
Because we think we can get away with it. Sure, that would be gross negligence. Now,
the argument has been made in the criminal trial suggests that's what happened.
I don't
know
which way the judge is going to go on this, but I know how he's going to decide. He's going to, if there is a trial, I happen to think the case will settle before the end of this week. But if there is a trial, this judge will sit and listen to the testimony of expert witnesses. The plaintiffs here are the government, the federal government, and the states of Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. And they are arguing they lost tax revenue because people couldn't work and earn a living and pay their taxes, which they did. That they spent a lot of money to keep people alive who couldn't work, which they did. That they had a lot of public property which was damaged, which they did. And that they're entitled to this money to compensate them for the money that they laid out and the money that didn't come in. So those are the arguments the judge is going to hear. The governments are going to put on witnesses who will demonstrate to the judge why it was gross negligence, and BP will put on witnesses. These are technical people, engineers, who will try and demonstrate to the judge that it was simple negligence, not gross negligence, and the judge will decide who he believes. So does BP want to roll the dice with this judge, or do they want to enter into a structured settlement where they'll pay some money now and some money in the future, rather than paying all of it at once, so much money that they're going to have to go out and borrow it and maybe even sell assets in order to pay it?
Oh. All right, Judge, we'll know from the tone of this thing, I think. We've learned a little bit about the tone this morning. Casey Stegall will be there to report for us, whether the plaintiffs or the defendants have the upper hand with the judge. May be known pretty quickly.
I think we'll probably know by the end of the week which way it looks like this is going to go, and they'll know, too, which will help settle as well.
Yes, it will. Judge Napolitano, thank you.
You're welcome.
President Obama says Republicans are blocking a deal that would stop mandatory budget cuts, about 2%, from going into effect at the end of the week. But legally, can't the president step in and stop the standoff himself?
Let's ask Judge Andrew Napolitano. He's our Fox News senior judicial analyst. Hi, Judge.
Morning, guys.
What can be done legally?
Well, start out with a couple of bases. The base is this is not a cut in spending. The sequester. The sequester is a reduction in the increased planned spending. It's not a budget cut because there's no budget.
It's a reduction in growth.
Right. Yes.
So growth.
Instead of growth like that, you're going to have, instead of more spending like that, you're going to have more spending like that. So, and how much is that? It's 2%. So if you're talking about the military, for example, the president wants to hire another 100 soldiers. Can he only hire 98? Of course not. He can hire all 100, and he can take that 2% cut in increased spending and apply it somewhere else in the Defense Department. The president has an obligation under the Constitution to make the federal government work and to make it do the things that we have hired it to do. You can't get on an airplane without going through the TSA. The plane can't get in the air without an air traffic controller. The country will not stay free and safe without soldiers. These are far more important than other operations of the government from which he could cut in order to keep those operations that we rely on every day at full force.
As Commander-in-Chief, he should be making any future reductions in future spending as easy as possible. But instead, he and his cabinet are out there, and they're scaring the living daylights out of people.
You know what?
They're becoming painful. He's become President Panic.
This is the key word, pain. This is almost an impeachable offense. If the president is deciding how to spend money in order to hurt us, rather than in order to provide us with the services for which we have paid and for which we have hired him, he is doing the opposite of what he has taken an oath to do. He has taken an oath faithfully, I underscore the word, it's in the oath and it's in the Constitution, to uphold the laws. That means make the government work. Don't make it painful. Find a way to make it work on 2% less.
Judge, is there a chance that in this legislation, which I was talking with Brett Baer yesterday about, he can't just cut out conventions or nebulous things. He has to go across and look at everything in these departments.
He has leeway.
He absolutely has leeway as the chief executive.
Then why are Republicans voted to give him leeway to cut where he wants?
The Republicans didn't vote to give him leeway.
They're about to.
Leeway is integral to his office as the chief executive, as the head of the executive branch. He can prioritize money and prioritize cuts. So if the Defense Department is told $80 billion less this year than we were going to give you. It's not $80 billion less than last year. It's still more than last year.
Yeah.
He can decide where that $80 billion is going to be cut, not in tanks and not in soldiers, but in something behind the scenes.
But instead...
Instead, he wants to cut in a way that's going to make us stand on line for 5 hours at the airport, quote, to teach the Republicans a lesson. You know what, Mr. President? We elected you to run the government, not to teach the Republicans a lesson.
All right. You're here to teach lessons. All right,
That's the way the Constitution works.
I know it. Thank you, sir.
A new debate today over the White House program using drones to target terrorists overseas, after former White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs admits that he was told he could never even acknowledge that this program existed.
You've seen recently the president discuss the need and desire to be more forthcoming. I certainly think there are aspects of that program that are and will remain highly sensitive and very secret. But let me give you an example here, Chris. When I went through the process of becoming press secretary, one of the first things they told me was, you're not even to acknowledge the drone program. You're not even to discuss that it exists.
Wow.
And so I would get a question like that, and literally I couldn't tell you what Major asked, because once I figured out it was about the drone program, I realized I'm not supposed to talk about it.
Well, now a growing list of media figures are taking issue with that admission. Judge Andrew Napolitano is our Fox News senior judicial analyst, and he's making light of it there, and it's sort of laughing, but this is extremely serious. And the fact that the administration had a drone program in place and kept it secret from the press and the American public is something that people on the left and the right have taken issue with. Your thoughts?
And rightly so. They should take issue with it. I mean, when the government lies or issues false statements or denies the obvious, denies things that we have strong reason to believe, in fact, are in existence, the government undermines the rule of law, it undermines its own moral authority, and it encourages other people to lie and to disrespect the basic rule of law.
But don't they do it all the time when
Yes.
it comes to, in particular,
Yes.
national security? And isn't there some merit in having our president be the decider of what is shared and what isn't it when we have troops in harm's way and the American public under terrorist threats?
I would argue that the drone program is so wide of the mark, killing people in countries with which we're friendly, countries where we could easily arrest people, countries with which we don't have a beef, countries where our troops and our intelligence agents can operate freely and in conjunction with the forces of that country, that the American public should know about it and the Congress should know about it. In fact, as you know, Megan, there are statutes that require the president to inform certain select members of Congress, they're the leaders of the intelligence committees in both houses, when the president is going to use lethal force inside the intelligence community.
This became an issue back under President Bush with the enhanced interrogation techniques.
Yes.
Remember the whole dust-up when Nancy Pelosi was saying, we were not told, and then it was, well, were they really told? Because others were saying that they were told, and so on. But my point is just simply that we have president after president, literally, I mean, Bush and then Obama, who have made these decisions in the name of national security and kept them secret. And Gibbs not telling us, not answering the press honestly, that's on President Obama. It's not on Gibbs.
Correct. Correct, it is. I mean, Gibbs probably would have lost his job or never gotten the job if he said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to lie for you.
You're the president's messenger. You're not an independent messenger.
Exactly. So he does place himself in an awkward situation. He has an inclination to want to tell the truth, as all human beings do, because he knows what the truth is, but his bosses won't let him tell the truth. Look, this is the problem with government today. It's a crime for you or me or anybody watching us now to lie to the government. Why isn't it a crime for the government to lie to us? This business of lying, especially when it's about deaths of human beings, seriously undermines respect people have for the government, and that attacks the fabric of our society. It attacks core, basic American values.
President Obama's being hit on this already because he made this promise to be the most transparent president and most transparent administration. But when you're talking about national security, I mean, just how transparent do we want to be? We don't want to be revealing secrets that might get troops killed or Americans killed to the outside world, do we?
You shouldn't be in the business of killing. You shouldn't be in the business of killing Americans. You shouldn't be in the business of killing people outside.
Killing terrorists?
Well,
we shouldn't be in the business of killing terrorists with drones?
You shouldn't be in the business of killing people in friendly territories. These are people that could easily be arrested, or people who could be taken care of by the government of the country in which they're located. But when the president thinks he can willy-nilly use drones, however, whenever, and against whomever he wishes, and then lie about it, we have a problem. Here's the other problem. This becomes a precedent. George W. Bush's use of drones was a precedent for Barack Obama to ratchet that up. Barack Obama's use of drones will be a precedent for whoever replaces him to ratchet it up.
Look at both situations. When it came out during the Bush years about enhanced interrogation, it came out in dribs and drabs, and then there was the so-called torture memo that was the legal justification within the administration that tried to say this is why this stuff isn't torture and so on. huge cause of consternation, in
Yes.
particular among the left. And now the same thing is happening with the drones. I mean,
Yes.
this past month, the legal justification leaked out from the administration on its justification for drones, and only now do we get to sort of check on our own to see whether we believe that legal justification is valid. Quickly.
The legal justification was hogwash. It was 16 pages of hundreds and hundreds of pages they won't let the rest of us see. These are not secrets. These are legal arguments based upon opinions by judges to which you and I can gain access, and the administration won't let us see them. It's wrong. And then when they lie and deny this stuff doesn't exist, they compound the wrong. This will haunt us today. It will haunt us in the future.
Judge, thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, forget the politicians. Now, unions are upping the ante in this spending cut fear-mongering. The latest airport runways are going to shut down. So forget about takeoffs. If the unions are indeed right, the only thing taking off, the number of flight delays and cancellations. Judge Andrew Napolitano objects. All rise. He's here, and he's pissed.
I wish I could say overruled to this, but because this is part of the president's fear-mongering. This is part of his efforts. Now he's conscripted his friends in the labor unions to scare the daylights out of the public, along with the other threats. You know, the soldiers aren't going to have bullets. The Social Security checks are going to be late. The prisoners are going to be let out of jail. Let's get a couple of facts down. This is not a decrease in spending. This is a decrease in the rate of increase in spending.
Very good.
Instead of spending going up like that, it's going to go up like that.
Do you know,
and it's 2%.
We're the only network that does that?
We are the only network that's explaining this, and the American public have the right to know. The president is creating a monstrosity over this sequester that was originally his idea.
Well, the runway thing, is the thinking being that if you lay off, or even for a brief period of time, a number of union runway operators, by definition, you shut down those runways.
That's up to the president, because there's no budget. The Congress hasn't given him a budget, so he has dollars to spend in each department as he sees fit.
And they've, in fact, given him the discretion to see what he thinks is
So,
fit.
Mr. President, you have X billion dollars to run the FAA and the TSA. Are you really going to make people wait online for 5 hours? Are you really going to shut down the runways? Or are you going to find some other place in which to nip and tuck? And remember, again, the nipping and tucking is not into the budget. It's in the increase in the budget. So if, for example, because he's got to cut 2% in the increase, instead of hiring 100 more soldiers or 100 more TSA agents or 100 more air traffic controllers, he hires 98. He can't live with that? We can't operate on that? Then he doesn't deserve to have this kind of discretion. And he's somebody who knows how to balance these things should have that discretion.
You know, it's kind of weird. And I don't care if people are right or left on this issue, but why have a meeting on Friday when all of this has taken effect to resolve the issue?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm surprised, candidly, that the Republicans are standing firm. It is far easier in this environment to spend less money than to tax the people more. People are taxed up to the hilt, and it simply won't get through the Congress. And the sooner the Democrats, the president, the labor unions, those folks recognize that spending is out of control and we can live our lives with a little less spending, the better off we all will be. Even they
who
want the more spending.
Never, ever, ever, ever dawn on them.
I think
Never.
you're right.
Judge, always good seeing you, my friend.
Pleasure, Neil.
The government is making a record number of requests now for the private information of you from Google. That's according to data released by the search engine giant. What's more startling is that over half of these requests are made without warrants. So is it constitutional? Who better to ask than Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. Good morning to you, Judge.
Good morning, Gretchen.
All right, so lay out for us what the law is right now. What can the government do?
Well, under the Constitution, the government can't get any information from about you or from you about you from anybody, from a telephone server to a provider to a computer server to your bedroom drawer without a search warrant. Search warrant is issued by a judge based upon sworn evidence of probable cause of crime. That's what the Constitution says. It covers everything. But gradually over the years, the government has worn away at that constitutional protection. In 1986, in the Reagan administration, the government enacted the Electronic Privacy Act, which basically said federal agents can write their own search warrants, bypass judges, and get information about you from banks. In 2001, the government did it again with the Patriot Act. So where does it stand today with emails, which is what Google reported yesterday? About a month ago, the Senate voted to prohibit the government from getting people's emails without a search warrant. The legislation died in the House. So the law as it now stands is federal agents can write their own search warrants to get your emails. Get your emails means emails stored not in your personal computer, but in the server's computer, and not the body of the email, but the identity of the sender and the receiver.
I see.
If the government wants the wording of the email itself, it has to go to a judge and get a warrant. Why am I aggravated about this? Why should everybody be aggravated
You seem so calm.
about this? Well, people should be aggravated about this because these are private communications which are protected by the Fourth Amendment. But the government has given itself. We didn't give to the government gave to itself the power to get this information about us. It always does it under a benign purpose. It always says we're doing it to keep you safe. But in reality, it is invading our privacy. And it's privacy that we have come to expect that we have.
Let's see what Google had to say about this. Before complying with a government request, we make sure it follows the law and Google's policies. We notify users about legal demands when appropriate, unless prohibited by law or court order. And if we believe a request is overly broad, we seek to narrow it, like when we persuaded a court to drastically limit a U.S. government request for 2 months of user search queries.
If Google does that, my hat is off to them, because if Google were to say to the Carlson or Napolitano household, the federal government has asked us to identify and isolate emails that you sent or you received, we want to tell you about that. You then have an opportunity to go to a federal judge and say, what's going on here? Where are my Fourth Amendment rights? But when the Google doesn't tell you that, like the federal government says, don't tell the Carlson household, then you don't know what the government has about you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Judge. You explained it brilliantly for
Pleasure.
this hour of the morning.
Pleasure, Gretchen
It's
Elizabeth.
great to see you.
Where's Kilmeade? Is he awake?
Now everyone knows my middle name. It was such a secret. Thanks, Judge.
An epic struggle over one man's freedom versus the power of government. A North Carolina outdoorsman finds himself in a struggle with his state over his chosen way of life on his private land. Eustace Conway, best known as the Mountain Man to some, opened a school to teach people how to live like our early American ancestors, blacksmithing and the like. Now the state is trying to shut him down. Trace Gallagher has the story. Trace?
Eustace Conway was 17 years old, Megan, when he says he took Henry Thoreau's advice and became a man of nature, and he went out and bought 500 acres of North Carolina wilderness and called it Turtle Island. He then turned it into a school and a camp that teaches others how to live with nature. But Turtle Island wasn't built by architects or engineers or Home Depot, all built with the materials at hand, which is now the problem. County officials say the compound violates building codes, safety regulations, and have ordered him to shut it down. Here's Eustace.
I mean, this is supposed to be the land of the free. Government is supposed to help people protect their individual liberties and freedom. That's not what's happening here. So I'm thinking, my gosh, this is the country that I pledge allegiance to every day?
So critics wonder why now, after 26 years, is the local government pressuring him? Conway says he fully passed a county investigation 10 years ago, and many believe that after he appeared on the History Channel's Mountain Men show that the county wanted to take a closer look. County officials say that's absolutely not true. This is about nothing more than safety and fairness, and that everybody has to pass an inspection, saying, quoting here, the primary concern of the county is that these visitors are in and out of these buildings, which were neither permitted nor inspected for compliance with the North Carolina Building Code. Eustace Conway says his back's pretty much against the wall. Listen.
I'm not confident I can win it. I'm confident I ought to win it. I'm confident it shouldn't be happening. But at this point, basically what the government told me today is, oh, you can't operate. This is something I've spent this much of my life on. I don't have that much left. If I have to die for this, I don't mind.
But he's not dead yet, and he has some help to fight this thing. Several lawyers and engineers are now working on his behalf, and 10,000 people have now signed a petition asking the county for a building code change, kind of a quintessential fight for rights. We'll let you know how this thing progresses. Right now, the camp is not in business.
Unbelievable. All right, Trace, thank you. And we want to say thanks to Bob Buckley of our Fox affiliate WGHP in Greensboro, North Carolina, for what is a great report. It's very long and it's really interesting, and we're posting it on our website shortly if you want to get it. It'll be foxnews.com/AmericaLive. Not there yet. Will be. So who's likely to win this fight? Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano is here. Judge, the guy says, look, I'm trying to live like our ancestors. It defeats the whole point of the building regulations and have the inspectors come on. It has to be done to code. It's like, get out of my business.
Right. I mean, you know, Megan, how I yearn to be the judge in this case. Obviously, that's not going to be the case. Regrettably, I think he'll probably lose because the trend in cases like this is conformity. The trend is to give building inspectors discretion, and if they want to put everybody in a pigeonhole, and if there's no pigeonhole to put him in, shut him down, the courts will probably go along with it. But when you think about it, the essence of private property is to do what you want, your ability to do what you want on your own property as long as you don't hurt anyone, and your ability to exclude anyone from private property that you want to exclude, even the government.
But they never let us do that.
Those, in fact, are the textbook definitions.
They never let us do that.
Property.
Even those of us who don't want to live like our ancestors have to comply with, you know, getting permits if we want to build a deck, and, you know, you have to have just a certain kind of, you know, windows or whatever it is. You can't paint your door this certain color in certain communities. I mean, it's like we all have to live with this to some extent. So, I mean, why shouldn't Eustace?
Eustace has a 26-year record of living like folks in America lived 175 years ago. He has a 26-year record of training people who want to know how to do this and doing it flawlessly. He takes very little money to run the school. He does it using old-fashioned means. They leave and they go on and they follow these means where they live. Suddenly, after the History Channel tells everybody about this wonderful pioneer-like patriot, the local government decides to come after him. Why don't they just give him an exemption? Give him a variance from the local zoning codes and let him be.
I haven't heard any reports of anybody getting hurt or anything like that. They're concerned somebody might. This is from the county. They say, look, we noticed that several buildings existed that we didn't know about, that no permits were sought for, over 20 in fact. His residence, sleeping quarters for interns, cabin rentals, activity center, maintenance facility, kitchen, dining facility, blacksmith building, They say lots of visitors come, many of whom are children, and it's our obligation to make sure the rules apply to everyone. Final thought,
It
Judge.
is. It is their obligation, but it's also their obligation to use common sense. And nobody stumbles into this place accidentally. It's in the middle of 500 acres, and the 500 acres, most respectfully to our friends in North Carolina, is in the middle of nowhere. Everyone who goes there knows what they're getting involved in, and they are there for that very purpose, to see what life is like untouched by government.
Yeah, he doesn't have electricity. He uses water out of the stream. Pa Ingalls would be very proud of him and very disappointed in the state of North Carolina. See you, Judge.
I'm proud of him.
Well, let's take this to the judge. Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano was with us. After what happened last week, I mean, he just kept winning point after point after point. Finally, she starts crying, admitting she did all these things. But today's different.
Well, today's different. As to last week, sometimes that hyper-aggressive grilling, shouting at her, cutting her off mid-sentence can backfire in the face of a prosecutor. I don't think it did here because the evidence of her guilt of something is overwhelming. The only question seems to be, did she plan and premeditate this? So is it first-degree murder, which would expose her to execution in Arizona, or is it second-degree murder, which is a long jail term, but at her age she'll have a life at the end of it? Today is a little different. Today is the effort of the defense counsel to try and rehabilitate her. Did he successfully do so? We might not know. But what will likely occur between now and your 7 o'clock show tonight is a very, very unique procedure in Arizona, Shep, whereby the jurors submit written questions to the judge. The judge reviews those questions with the lawyers without the jurors present during the time of the review, and then the judge reads the jurors' questions that she has approved to Ms. Arias, and she has to answer them.
Never heard of this. I've not covered a trial in Arizona, lots of states, but not Arizona. Normally there's direct examination,
right,
then cross-examination,
right,
then redirect,
right,
and then, which means the defense comes back on, which began today, And now you're telling me about this phase where the jury submits questions.
You know, the courts have resisted this for years because you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know how the juror who asked the question is going to react to the answer. You don't know if the question sort of tips the hands of the jurors as to how what their thinking is, and whether counsel should change what they're going to do for the rest of the case in response to what they think the jury is thinking now. Sometimes I myself have seen juror questions. Sometimes they are terrific, and they simply ask something that you as the judge and the lawyers in the case didn't think of. Other times they're completely off the wall. They reveal way too much. It's a compound question that asks many questions at once, and you got to narrow it down. Very, very interesting. Could be explosive. It could send the case decidedly in one direction or the other. We have to wait and see.
One thing that lawyers try to avoid is opening up new areas for discussion, especially the defense. You don't want to ask a question that allows the prosecution then to come back and say, well, you said this, now we can explore that area. Can a jury question do that or not?
Well, that's why the judge reviews these questions ahead of time, to make certain that those questions are not about new areas that would unnaturally and unusually extend the length of the case.
So we'll get to those questions presently.
I think we'll get to those questions within the next hour, and you'll probably have a field day with them on your next show
Well, I
tonight.
look forward to hearing what these jurors might be curious about at this point after 14 days of this woman on the stand and all that they've heard.
What could they not have heard after 14 days?
More than we can report here.
Yes.
Judge, thank you.
Pleasure, Shep.
And some PC sirens. All right, now imagine this story. A child is punished for disarming a gunman and protecting his peers on a bus. A Florida high school student recently suspended from school after he wrestled a loaded gun away from a student who was threatening to shoot. According to reports, he was given an emergency suspension for being part of an incident where a weapon was present. But is this zero tolerance gone too far? Where's the common sense? Joining us now is Fox News senior judicial analyst, who is full of common sense, Judge Andrew Napolitano.
Thank you, Gretchen. Good morning.
So how do you break this case down?
Well, this is a misguided rule, the rigid enforcement of which has produced an injustice. You have a young man here who saved the life of a fellow student, of a deranged student with a gun, football player with a gun, comes in and menaces and threatens another student. This kid comes by and wrestles the gun away from him. By doing that, he saved the life of the target, and he saved the life of all the other students there, and he gets suspended. It's sort of putting society in a position where you're afraid to do the right thing. Like the nurse in the nursing home situation you talked about with Heather Nauert a few segments ago. Right. It's human nature to want to save an innocent life. There shouldn't be an official punishment for engaging in an act of heroism like this.
So the rule there is zero tolerance. You believe that there should be an exception to the rule, that there should be some sort of amendment saying something to the effect of except when reasonably necessary.
To save a life, absolutely. The zero tolerance is for fighting. Well, you know what? A fight could be defensive. If someone strikes you in the mouth with their fist, you have the right to repel them, to prevent them from striking you again. And if someone is about to kill somebody and you have the means to stop them, you have the natural right, some would even argue the duty, to stop them. But when the PC police in schools suspend a child for going like this with his finger, mimicking a gun, and the same mentality suspends a child for defending the innocent lives of others, something's very wrong. The police can't be everywhere all the time. The police recognize that.
And it stops people from wanting to get involved. Here's the school statement. We cannot discuss specifics involving students. Florida law allows the principal to suspend a student immediately pending a hearing. You got to feel for the parents of this child as well, who probably raised a good kid and taught him all the right lessons, and now very confusing message being
So
sent.
now he's the goat. We don't even know what happened to the guy with the gun. Presumably he's been arrested and will be prosecuted for attempted murder. But there's a living human being in that class who owes his life to the intervention of this kid sitting on a suspension duty.
All right, Judge, thanks very much. Have a great day.
Welcome. You too, my dear.
Fox News alert: Colorado becoming a hotspot in the fight over Second Amendment rights today after a legislative committee approves a controversial bill that would make weapons manufacturers and sellers liable for crimes committed with their guns. Brand new hour here of America Live. Welcome, everyone. I'm Megyn Kelly. This legislation would become one of the most dramatic gun laws in the country and is polarizing the state. The lawmakers in Colorado believe they have the votes. Crowds of gun supporters rallied outside the State House yesterday, where victims of gun violence testified in hearing rooms that were packed with people. There were survivors of Columbine, relatives of Sandy Hook victims, and in high-profile testimony, astronaut Mark Kelly, whose husband, a former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, herself a victim of gun violence back in 2011. There were strong arguments on all sides.
I'm speaking out today because you have to be out of your mind to believe that someone with a plan to kill will not get their hands on a gun.
A background check is not a burden.
I'm telling you, this law is unenforceable.
I believe their Second Amendment is under assault.
Rights demand responsibility, and this right does not extend to criminals.
Wow. While Colorado is working on a number of new gun laws, this liability issue is getting a lot of attention. Judge Andrew Napolitano is our Fox News senior judicial analyst, and what they are trying to do is impose criminal liability or civil liability?
Civil liability.
For whom exactly?
For the manufacturer and the seller or the reseller if the gun is used to commit a crime.
So if I'm in a gun shop business, I got a gun shop and I sell somebody a gun and they go out and they use it and kill somebody, I could potentially get sued as the gun shop owner?
Yes, as could the manufacturer from whom you bought the gun. And if the person to whom you sold it sells it to another person, then the person to whom you sold it could be liable for the criminal behavior of the ultimate user. That's why you heard in one of the clips you just ran, police testifying at this hearing, this is unenforceable. You can't possibly impose a burden on D, the third person.
How far down the line can you go?
For what A did. I mean, think about it. Can we hold General Motors liable because an automobile kills someone, even if it's used recklessly, even if it's used criminally? Of course not. We just don't do that in America. This transference of liability is basically wrong and unfair.
Now, help me understand this, because back in 2005 or 2006, around there, we were starting to see, after they went after sort of big tobacco, and some plaintiffs' lawyers got big payouts from the tobacco industry.
They did.
Then they decided to try to go after the big guns and the manufacturers and say, let's sue gun manufacturers and we'll get a lot of money for, gun violence. And the feds passed a law saying you can't do this, didn't they?
Correct. It's a federal statute enacted in 2005, signed by President George W. Bush, that specifically says the manufacturer and the seller, we're talking about a full-time dealer now, cannot be held liable for the criminal use by the end user of the product.
Why isn't that ballgame? How could Colorado get around that?
They can't. They can't. So I think that what Colorado is doing now is either woefully ignorant of federal law or is just making a political statement. Because if this legislation, which is going to go to the governor's desk, I think by the end of the week, if the governor signs it, I think it will be enjoined by a federal judge within minutes.
This piece of it, anyway.
Right, because it is in direct contradiction of the federal statute. And as your viewers know from watching your show, when the two clash, the federal statute prevails.
Yeah, that's what happened in Arizona, and it's happened elsewhere on other issues. But
Precisely.
I want to ask you this, and there are other items in the bill. They want 15-clip ammunitions. They want background checks, more extensive background checks, as you heard there, and some other items that are less controversial. But less controversial than this one.
This is truly radical, this transference of liability.
Last night I'm sitting at home watching O'Reilly, and I see Jesse Waters. You know Jesse, right?
Right. Waters World.
Waters World. So Bill sent him out to Colorado because while Colorado is focused on imposing liability on gun shop owners and gun manufacturers, the speaker, I think this is the Speaker of the House, I want to get his name, hold on one second, I'll get it, is out there trying to stop Jessica's law, trying to Mark Ferrandino. Okay, Mark Ferrandino. This is the guy who's stopping Jessica's law, which would tighten penalties for child molesters, from getting a real vote out by the lawmakers there. And Jesse Waters confronted him. Watch this.
You're not protecting the kids from sexual predators and passing Jessica's law. Why is that?
Well, no DAs. The DAs actually have opposed Jessica's law, so have victim rights groups.
44 other states have Jessica's law. 44 other states have Jessica's law. And you guys think you're smarter? Is that true?
No, I think we know what's in Colorado's best interest. I will go with the people of Colorado who are the ones in the trenches fighting this, prosecuting people who don't support Jessica's law and say we have tougher laws than Jessica's laws in Colorado. Thank you.
Okay, well, you're lucky O'Reilly wasn't here today, sir.
He probably is.
So at the same time, you got the Colorado House Speaker, Mark Ferrandino, a Democrat out there, trying to stop tighter penalties greater penalties for child molesters. You got them pushing through legislation that's going to cut back on people's ability to have the gun of their choice, the weapon of their choice, the ammunition of their choice, and impose liability on gun manufacturers.
Right. I don't know what's in his brain or motivation, but it's a truism that frequently laws are written because people want to stay in power. So he must feel there's some political support for trying to transfer liability to gun owners. He must also feel, I don't know where, that there's some political support for not having a Jessica's Law
Which
out there.
44 states have.
Right, exactly. The bottom line with Colorado is this statute will be stopped by a federal judge. If it's not, it will make the ownership of guns so expensive that ordinary people who want to protect themselves won't be able to afford them. And that very act will be unconstitutional. The government can't burden your exercise of your freedoms, so the exercise becomes so costly that you're deterred from enjoying them.
If they pass this and it doesn't, and somehow it withstands constitutional muster, what gun manufacturer is going to want to sell guns in Colorado?
They'll all be black market sales, and that'll have the opposite effect from what Colorado wants.
All right, Judge. Well, it's always interesting. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure, Megan.
All right, these spending cuts might have you waiting for your tax refund, but Uncle Sam not waiting a nanosecond, grabbing cash for the new health care law. All rise, because we've got a very, very angry judge in the House, Judge Napolitano. So much to get into with, including what's happening on the floor of the Senate right now. But first on this.
Right.
And sequestration, I guess, run amok.
Look, the president said for months that these cuts were across the board, that he had no discretion. We now know that there is discretion because we've seen emails from the Department of Agriculture in which a mid-level manager said, you know, I've got to make sure that the meat inspections work. And his boss says, oh, no, you're going to cut consistent with the president's message. My goodness, are they spending our money, or money they borrowed in our name, in order to hurt us rather than in order to make the government work? If that's the case, it's an impeachable offense because it's the opposite of what he was elected to do. He was elected to make the government work, not to use the government to hurt us.
And clearly what's coming through in the case of the underlings is they seem to think they have broad parameters what can be cut. And that's the message that's not getting through.
Well, they do. And one of the reasons they do is the president's own fault. We don't have a budget.
Right.
We have spending goals, but we don't have a budget. If there were a specific budget, thou shalt spend X on project Y, they'd have no choice. But where there is no budget, the government hasn't had one, even though this federal law requires it, in 4 years, they have broad discretion. Hire the soldiers, drop the janitors. Hire the meat inspectors, drop the clerks. Do what's necessary to preserve the freedom and the safety of the public and worry about the other stuff later. He's not doing that. He's instructing his people, or his people are instructing their people, so to speak.
Yeah.
My people,
My
your
people will.
Right. If you're from New Jersey, you use that phrase a lot. To hurt the American public. And that's just wrong. The government shouldn't do that.
Something else you argue the government shouldn't be doing, and something that Rand Paul is fighting right now with is what we're into our 4th hour, this filibuster here on this drone stuff. And he's got a number of Democrats supporting it, Robert Wyden and others. What do you make of this whole thing and what it says about a bipartisan angst over the use of drones against Americans?
I'll tell you that, you know, I was against the use of drones in the Bush administration. I criticized Bush Cheney. Barack Obama makes Dick Cheney look like Mohandas Gandhi by comparison. If he thinks that he can use drones to kill Americans in America, a position from which his Attorney General refused to back off yesterday or today, I forget when he was testifying in the Congress.
But the world doesn't get Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, all potential future presidential candidates.
Right.
But this has become a huge issue now.
Absolutely. These senators are correct. I don't think they have the numbers with which to stop this. But perhaps by making this point, they will open up the eyes of the American public. The Constitution couldn't be clearer. If the government wants the life, the liberty, or the property of a person, they have to do it through due process, which means a jury trial. They can't just execute. That's Stalinistic for the government to say, well, we're executing our enemies. We don't have time for a jury trial. It's too difficult to prosecute them, too cumbersome to arrest them. We fought a revolution so that that type of government wouldn't happen here.
Imagine if George Bush were president with this. Now, to you, and to be fair to you, you're against this regardless of who's pushing it.
Absolutely.
But, I mean, if this were George Bush pushing it right now, in the numbers we're talking about, right now.
I'll tell you who'd be opposing it if George Bush were pushing this. A senator from Illinois by the name of Barack Obama, because he did when he was a senator. Oh, how the world must look so different when
So
you're on
you
the
don't
inside
buy
of the White
I'm
House.
actually looking after you and keeping you safe argument.
No, I don't buy it at all. And more importantly, the Constitution doesn't buy it, and he took an oath to uphold it, and federal law, which he took an oath to enforce, doesn't buy it.
How did this get so big, by the way? So out of control, where I thought at first, they were talking, 5 or 6 drones, 1,000 of these. What?
I think it got out of control because the president knows by using the CIA to kill people, even bad people, he escapes statutes that govern him when he uses the military. By using them secretly, he doesn't have to reveal, justify, promise, or discuss as he would if he was using the military openly. I think that's issue number one. I think issue number two, this got over the top when it became apparent that he killed Americans. Not only this Anwar al-Awlaki fellow, but his 16-year-old son, born in Colorado, and the son's American friend. And when Robert Gibbs, the president's former press secretary, was asked about it, how can you justify killing the boy? His answer was about as cold a disconnect as you can imagine. The boy should have chosen a different father. Well, that's inconceivable. That's a defect in thinking to make a statement like that. Not, we're sorry the boy was killed, but the boy should have chosen a different
Cheney had
father.
said that. Oh my gosh.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the government's out of control, and Senator Paul is leading the charge to rein it in.
All right. And you're clarifying it for all of America.
I'm doing my best.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, thank you. You don't want to get him when he's angry, when he's thin. Oh, my God.
Proof of the administration's square-quester tactics, a leaked government email shows a push for agencies to make budget cuts more painful than necessary. And it comes as we learn Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano plans to release thousands of illegals, saying the sequester has left her no choice. These were illegals in being detained. Meanwhile, but is keeping hurt onto the American public constitutional? Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano says, I'm going to tell you right now, folks, he says no.
Gosh, this is really a new low for the government. My hat is off to Senator Paul. The public needs to know about drones. The president can't kill whoever he wants. Right. The president also has an obligation to make the government work. So if a mid-level manager in the Department of Agriculture says to his bosses, I have a way to make the meat inspectors be able to do all their meat inspection and to delay some other work that's not necessary to be done right now, and he's stopped from doing it, because that's not painful enough for the American public, because that's not consistent with the administration's propaganda, that is not doing his job, that is not enforcing the federal law, and instead of saying, I'll work with you, I'll help you, like Ronald Reagan would have, it's, I told you so.
Right.
I told you, I'm from New Jersey, I told you so.
I've seen
That's basically what the president is doing to the American people when he does this.
Judge, you're saying the president of the United States is deliberately inflicting pain on people. For instance, how many school groups saved for the last year or so they could go to Washington, D.C. during the cherry blossom season, tour the White House, among other things, and now that's closed because it costs $18,000 a week. And the White House wants to save
How
that
about
money.
taking the $50 million that Janet Napolitano, cousin Janet, kidding, we're not related, spent on new uniforms for TSA agents and using it towards allowing those school kids to be able to visit the White House during spring break? Look, I'm not a micromanager. The president apparently is. And he's micromanaging the government in a way consistent with his message of pain, not consistent with his constitutional obligation to enforce the laws whether he agrees with them or not.
Exit question. Is what he's doing constitutional?
It's within his power to do it, but it is so offensive, it's impeachable.
Okay. Judge Andrew Napolitano, there's the impeachment word.
I hate to raise that
times
word.
in 2
The
weeks.
last time it happened, it was a disaster.
Absolutely.
For us. But this willful conduct is unacceptable.
All right, Judge Napolitano, thank you.
Pleasure.
Right now, a lot of attention is on our nation's drone policy after Kentucky Senator Rand Paul filibustered, spoke for nearly 13 hours in that rare move, focusing on what he says is the Obama administration's refusal to rule out the possibility of drone strikes on U.S. citizens. Paul saying no American should ever be killed by a drone on American soil without first being charged with a crime and found guilty by a court. Joining us now, Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. I know you have some pretty strong feelings about the drone program.
Well, Senator Paul and I are on the exact same page. He and I have discussed this many times. We did not discuss how one stands and stays awake and lives as a normal human being for 13 hours on the well of the Senate.
And that wasn't even the record. Strom Thurmond did it more than 24 hours.
I don't know how Strom Thurmond did that, because, you know, they have to stay standing and they can't leave for the normal things that we would all want to take a break for.
Yeah.
But in terms of the essence of what he did he succeed in preventing John Brennan from becoming the head of the CIA? Probably not. There's enough votes to confirm him, and that vote will be today, tomorrow, or Saturday. But I don't think that was his real goal, John. John, I think his goal was to open up the eyes of the American public to the attitude of the White House, which seems to be, we can kill whoever we want, how we want, without revealing it to the public, without even revealing it to Congress, and we're not even going to answer Senator Paul's letter about how we got here historically, legally, and constitutionally. Because the Constitution couldn't be clearer. If the government wants life, liberty, or property, it must take it through due process. Due process can mean a declared war against an enemy combatant, but it cannot mean killing a guy, an American or not, sitting in a cafe having lunch with his 16-year-old son.
We use the drone program, obviously, in places like Afghanistan. We've taken out a number of terrorists in there and in North Africa as well. Is it such a slippery slope to imagine, you know, drones at some future point being used on the streets of, I don't know, New York City?
Well, I think it is for a couple of reasons. When this question was put to the Air Force about 6 months ago, the Air Force responded by saying, we expect to have applications for 30,000 drones in the U.S. in the next 10 years. The vast majority will be owned by state and local police. Will they be used just for surveillance, or will they be used offensively? And more interestingly, John, when Bob Mueller, the director of the FBI, was asked if drones can be used to kill people, he said, ask the White House. When John Brennan, the soon-to-be director of the CIA, was asked the same question, he said, ask the White House. When the Attorney General was asked that question, he hemmed and hawed and went back and forth with the great Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, and eventually, after much hemming and hawing, said no. But it's very, very dangerous that this is not a clear and crystal and pristine and immediate no. Of course not. With this isn't Stalin Russia. We don't do this.
And he said, you know, I thought I made that clear after a lot of hemming and hawing.
He didn't make it clear. Senator Paul has made it clear to the public that the White House is contemplating these type of murders, and the White House and anybody in the government who thinks they can do this needs to be restrained and needs an eye-opener. Yesterday they got it. But should he have to suffer his body and soul through 13 hours of standing and, let's face it, not going to the bathroom in order to open up the country's eyes? That's the situation we're in today.
The brave new world, not that far away.
No, not that far away at all. When Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, and Orwell wrote these things, we figured it's science fiction. Now it's here.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, always good to get your take. Thank you.
Pleasure.